welcome to today's HCD webinar in our series that we do frequently throughout the years. We will get started just momentarily as people continue to filter in. As a reminder, this is the HCD webinar series, a frank discussion on junk science in emotions research. We will start just momentarily. Hi, everyone. And again, welcome to a frank discussion on junk science in emotion research, where we will be discussing understanding consumer emotions as it is a big part of business interests, but exploring emotions quickly becomes more complex than anticipated. It's easy to come up with examples of emotions, happy, sad, angry, but defining these feelings and mood spaces can be nearly impossible since the term emotion means different things to different people. Enthusiasts can quickly get carried away by the suggestion of quick and easy ways to get the answers that they want. And most of the troubles can be attributed to misunderstanding of the science, combined with reliance on trusting researchers who push the limits of the tools and technologies. In an attempt to accommodate expectations and keep the flashiness of the topic alive, emotion research is often plagued with difficulties ranging from misused tools to overreaching and unsupported claims. Conducting impactful research requires planning, critical thinking, and consideration of context. So today, we're going to be discussing, alongside a talented group of experts, the impact of poor research designs and overarching interpretations when investigating consumer emotions, challenges in the space, including problems with terminology, knowledge gaps, and overlooked nuances, how to integrate emotion data to better and more actionable informed conclusions and interpretations, and also a discussion about what the future holds for emotions research. So welcome to the webinar today. So a few notes on what's going to happen today. First, some housekeeping. Please feel free to interact with us. While we have a set of topics we hope to cover, we will welcome any comments or questions from attendees. So please feel free to ask anonymously through the Q&A function or more publicly with the chat option. We will be providing the recording to attendees after this live stream, so look out for that. Also, feel free to reach out individually to the panelists later with follow-up questions or email one of us at HCD and we can direct your connection. A quick intro of our panelists. We have Michelle Lani Shioda. Now, she is an associate professor of psychology at Arizona State University and director of the Substance Use and Addiction Translational Research Network. She received her bachelor's degree from Stanford and her doctoral degree in social and personality psychology from UC Berkeley. Her research investigates positive emotions, emotion regulation, emotional processes and close relationships, and emotion-related mechanisms of behavior change. She's also the editor of the Handbook of Positive Emotions, author of the textbook Emotion and Motivation, and co-editor-in-chief of the Journal of Affective Science. Dr. Tian Yu obtained her PhD in neuroscience, focusing on fat and sour taste signal transduction. After a postdoc fellowship focusing on lipid metabolism, Dr. Yu devoted herself to sensory and consumer science to combine her love of sensory neuroscience and expertise in data science as a computational sensory scientist. She is now director of sensory at Agora, a technology company that helps sensory and consumer teams to implement artificial intelligence. Pedro Almeida is CEO of MindProber. He holds a PhD in psychology in the field of cognitive and affective neuroscience. He was resident researcher in the neuropsychophysiology department from 2007 to 2012 and a professor of biosocial criminology from 2012 to 2022 at the University of Porto. His research expertise includes the cognitive electrophysiology of emotional processing, neurobiology of criminal behavior, and psychopathy and applied psychophysiology. Toby Coates is also joining us today, and he has spent the last 25 years working in the FMCG consumer research industry with MMR. Sensory has always been at the heart of everything MMR does, and over recent years, Toby's focus has been how sensory attributes of products and brands don't just drive consumer appeal, but also deliver desirable emotional outcomes to drive longer-term repertoire purchasing behavior, ultimately applying this knowledge to the development of tools to help clients create more successful products and brands. And now I'm going to give a brief overview of the topic we're going to be discussing today to make sure we can all get on the same page. If you have any questions, also feel free to enter something into the chat and we will work on answering that for you. So these are some of the modern consumer science or consumer neuroscience methodologies or behavioral science measurements for emotion research. Now, it's important to keep in mind that when it comes to measuring the brain, each method has its own purpose and its place. Some are really good at one thing and terrible at another. No measure can fully encapsulate all that the brain is doing. Its structures are not only redundant internally, but also often contradictory. So we have hundreds of structures associated with eating behavior, for example. Why? Because it is so vital to survival. But also within a structure, we can have two completely opposite emotions, like love can also be in the same location as disgust. And yet we know the difference. So being able to identify structures doesn't necessarily help us fully understand behaviors or label thoughts. We cannot read minds. So from left to right here, we have methods that are somewhat easier and cheaper on the left to methods that are more involved, complicated, and considered to be more neuro on the right. Each has their faults, none are perfect, but you should always make sure you're using the right tool for the right research question, as they are not one size fits all. And they also can't replace one another, so they are measuring completely different things. So one thing to note here, and that we can talk about more with our panelists, is that there are different theories of emotions that don't necessarily agree. Some of these measures, like facial coding, is more categorical and don't fit the same theory of emotion as, say, EEG, which is more neuro-based. So none of them can replace one another, and certainly they don't mean the same thing. Outputs can vary wildly and even contradict one another. So interpretation of any of them is very dependent on the theory you ascribe to. And so a thorough understanding of emotional theory is very important in using them properly, both in research design and interpretation, which leads us to this next slide, which is anybody can purchase these and start running studies. Anyone can buy these tools and equipment, and you can go on Amazon right now and purchase your own EEG headset and laying claim that you are reading minds. So there is caution that needs to be taken when it comes to consumer neuroscience, which is what leads us to the ICO. So due to these issues and advances, especially when we come to AI technologies, the ICO has stepped into the debate. Now, the ICO is the UK's independent body set up to uphold information rights. Its role is to uphold information rights, particularly when it's in the public interest. So with particular interest in AI, due to the potential of high risk to individual rights and freedoms, they did put out a statement towards the end of last year stating that immature biometric technologies could be discriminating against people. And what they mean by that is, in talking about the write-up itself, talking about how emotional analysis technologies in particular, including eye gaze and sentiment analysis, facial movements, all these sort of heartbeats and facial expressions, that they come with some problems, and that there's an inability of algorithms which are not sufficiently developed to be able to actually detect emotional cues. So they gave out this warning. And we don't believe that you should throw out the baby with the bathwater in this, but absolutely there are concerns to be had. So now, without further ado, let's get into the conversation with our panelists. So I will go ahead and end this share, and we can all start coming on our videos. And I want to welcome our panelists into this discussion, and welcome also everybody into the chat. If you have any particularly interesting questions that you would like to ask, but let's start right up. I want to ask a quick question of our panelists, which is, what are emotions? And I believe we're missing John at this point. But what are emotions? I think we're going to start with Lonnie, because you are perhaps the more you are the academic expert on the panel. So how would you define emotions? What are they?
Because I started laughing at me. I was like, start with an easy one. Why don't you? I'm not going to try to give a single answer to that question. I actually don't think that there's a single valid answer to that question. And it really gets to the heart of this issue of when we try to measure emotions, there's actually a lot of different things. That's a catch-all term for a lot of different aspects of psychological and biological experience that predict behavior and are associated with behavior. On one hand, they are associated with behavior. That's why we're interested in them. On the other hand, they cannot be equated with each other. So broadly speaking, when we talk about emotions, the way that I use the term, we are talking about a at least moderately instinctive response to what we believe is happening in the environment and the implications of what's happening in the environment for our own well-being. And the way that we can observe an emotional response. Emotions are generally geared toward trying to do something about that situation, right, in a functional way. But the way that we can observe those motivational responses is through indicators, imperfect indicators, but indicators that include some of the measures that you're talking about. So they can include nonverbal cues such as facial expressions of emotion and tones of voice and posture. They can include physiological changes such as changes in heart rate and sweat gland activity, which is what skin conductance is picking up on. And they can certainly include feelings and reports of feelings, right, as well as behavioral intentions. Those are all indicators of motivational responses we have to events and objects in the environment that are important to us, that seem consequential to us. But that is a very abstract definition by intent, and even that is highly controversial.
Yeah, and their emotions are very important. So it is somewhat to survival, right? To be able to react in ways that are appropriate, but also how to communicate with one another. I'm not a threat to you. You're not a threat to me, right?
Exactly. And especially when we talk about nonverbals, right? That presumably the point of nonverbal indicators of emotion is that we can communicate with each other about what those motivational states are, right? So whether that is someone that we are close to, being clear about that, and intentions to help and intentions to support, caring, intentions to cooperate, right? Or someone that is a threat and saying, hey, back off, right? Or whatever else, or you're sick, get away from me, right? Whatever
Yeah.
it is. Communicating those motivational states is certainly important, as well as enacting behaviors that carry them out.
And maybe I'll toss this over to Toby. Why do you think emotions might be important in business? So when it comes to consumer products, why are emotions important?
Well, I think, particularly in this day and age, I mean, we've got so many choices out there that are available to us whenever we have to go out and buy, food, drink products, anything out there, there's 30 different alternatives to everything that we want to choose. And, it might have been that a long time ago, just being good when there weren't many options was fine to help people make decisions that on what they want to buy. But this day and age, we're just absolutely saturated with lots of different choices that we've got to make, and we tend to shop on autopilot a lot of the time. So, once you kind of just there's no bad products out there anymore, really. We're all pretty good at what we do, so we're faced with all of these really great alternatives. So, for some reason we have, there'll be something out there that engages us more than the other alternatives do, and it's probably something that we'll keep coming and buying again and again and again without thinking about it, because it's delivering some sort of emotional reward to us at the end of the day that we may not be consciously aware of, but for some reason it makes the decision a lot easier for us as to what we want to buy moving forwards. Now, if you sort of go beyond just producing great tasting products or products that receive high liking ratings in consumer tests, and you've got to try and think about what that other piece is that you have the potential to be able to access that can be a differentiator. And I think everybody agrees now that emotion is sort of one of the big drivers of choice. But
I think we recognize that, because when you measure liking, one would think in order to predict buying, the person must like the product, but measuring liking has not been a good predictor of purchase behavior, correct?
Yeah, exactly right. And it's not just about encouraging people to buy a product these days. You have to encourage them to buy it once, you have to get them to repeat trial, and then you have to get them to buy on autopilot after that. So it becomes a repertoire purchase. And it's very easy to do consumer testing, for example, and understand whether you're going to put a product out there that's going to encourage people to pick it up once off the shelf. What we are very, very bad at predicting at the moment is whether we're going to encourage people to keep coming back again and again and again, and to make it an instinctive purchase.
I think that that's a really good point to bring up. And Pedro, you have a slightly different look at this, which has been more from the media and communication standpoint. Why is it so easy for companies then to sort of misconstrue what they've heard about emotions' impact on consumer behavior or consumers' interest?
Well, I think that if I understood your question is, so what you're asking is, why is this misinterpreted by by buyers, let's say? Or, well, I think that on one hand, when you look at how emotion today is used in, or emotion is used in media research, so most of the buyers, what they want is to sort of, show quality of their content on one hand. So if you're talking about the publishers, what they want is sort of show the quality of their content, show the quality of their media, show the quality of my channel. And one easy claim is to say, well, people are more emotional engaged when they're actually being exposed to my content. And sort of the market sees this as a sort of inherent proof of the inherent quality of the medium. Okay, we all know that emotion is good. We all know that positive emotion is good, and hence, if people are in a good emotional state, and hopefully more in my channel than in other channels, more in my network than in other networks, then this is showing the value of my channel, of my property, of my IP. And so most of the things that you see here are actually publishers, on one hand, trying to show the quality and trying to sell the quality. And then, of course, making all sorts of, because we know that these signals are complex, because we know that we can get multiple indicators of an emotional state, because we know we can use multiple technologies and get multiple indexes. Then, you get a bunch of measures, you make multiple comparisons, you pick the one that tells the story, and you say, hey, here's the one. So I picked this one, and here it is, and I built a really nice PR piece around it. So it is around the motivation usually of the client and what they really want to show. Most clients want to do. I learned this expression with someone who, I'll say her name because I learned a lot with her, Janet Kellen, who said once taught me there's no research and there is show research, and most clients want to do show research.
Yeah.
Hey, I don't want to know anything. I just want to make a claim. And then I use a bunch of measures, and I choose the one. And so it's sort of, not that they're mistaken, it's that they're willingly mistaking themselves, I would say. And then it's
so it's an interesting thing to acknowledge, which is quite different potentially. I don't know, Lonnie, from your viewpoint, when you look at it in your research and see your colleagues in academia, would they say that there are ways to effectively and reliably, validly measure emotions? And with that, like, what do you use in your research?
So I use all of, I have not personally done fMRI research, but I've done pretty much everything else that you used. Done eye tracking, facial expression coding. I actually just trained a new cohort of students in my lab yesterday to start doing EKG hookups. So I use all those measures all the time. I don't have a problem with the measures at all. The issues come about in regard to the question that's being asked. And the assumptions that are made about what is being measured. So a really useful distinction here that is kind of first year PhD training, this will resonate with the other folks who have a behavioral science degree, is the distinction between a construct and an operational measure, right? So we're studying things that happen under the hood, right? They're phenomena that happen inside the human mind. When we talk about emotion and motivation and thoughts and feelings, those are all in here. And so the best that we can do as scientists is find some kind of correlated output that we can concretely observe, whether that is a rating on how sad do you feel on a scale from 1 to 10 right now, or a change in sweat gland activity or heart rate, or a change in muscle activity on the face, right? But it is not equivalent to the construct, the thing that we measure. It's an indicator of it that is imperfectly correlated at best. So the way that a good researcher, and I would argue that most researchers in my field who are active in publishing know what they're doing and are using these measures thoughtfully. What they're doing, we hope, is saying, I want to measure arousal. I want to measure felt positivity. I want to measure approach motivation. I want to measure learned fear, right? A learned aversive response. These are the things from a construct level that are the thing that I'm trying to study. What is the measure that's most appropriate for that? So let's take skin conductance, right? Again, we're just talking about sweat gland activity. If what you're trying to measure is arousal, it is literally a measure of a certain branch of activation in a very specific branch of the fight-flight sympathetic nervous system, not even the entire fight-flight.
Right.
One branch of it. That is exactly what you're measuring. There is no construct. That is what you're measuring. If you want to get to construct, now we're talking about what it's correlated with. Well, it's correlated with attention to some extent. You put a new stimulus in front of everybody, you're going to get a burst of sweat gland activity. It's because they're paying attention to it. It's associated with subjective experiences of arousal, and it can be an indicator of subjective felt arousal. Again, it's not equivalent to it, but it's not a bad proxy for it. But once you start getting to, it means you're scared, or it means you're lying, or it means any of the other more complicated psychological inferences that we draw, you're looking at really loose correlations now. And the extent to which that inference is valid depends a great deal on the context, right? That's why most courts won't accept lie detection tests.
Right. I think that's a really good point. And something, since you were even describing it as being under the hood, right? We have a really good question here that's in the chat that says, if we aren't aware of our own emotional reaction to something, how does it help for someone else to analyze it? And use it as a data point? If I'm not even aware of it myself and have no chance to rationalize my emotional reaction.
Great question. So I'm guessing that thank you for the question. I'm guessing that what the that individual is asking about and talking about emotion is feelings of emotion. Like if I don't know that I'm scared, if I don't know that I'm feeling a certain way, then how does it help to even know that? I think that we're in a territory where most people can tell you, I feel sad, right? There's arguably not a better measure for being sad than someone telling you, I feel sad, right? That's really straightforward. If what you're looking at is appetitive motivation, which is very important for purchasing, right? People don't always have a good label for that. And so there might be indirect
like wanting, and
people are not necessarily aware in the moment of what grabs their attention the most.
Right.
So if you're interested in, you've got 5 stimuli, which one pulls people's attention fastest? Well, that's someplace where eye tracking is going to give you more precise information about that than someone's self-report. So labeling what most of us think of as emotion, feeling sad or happy or whatever it is, frequently self-reports the most reliable indicator of that for many purposes. But once we drill down into, well, what do we mean by emotion? Are we talking about attention, arousal? Are we talking about positivity? Are we talking about appetitive versus avoidance motivation? People can't necessarily report on those in the moment.
I think that's a really good point. There are things that people can't easily tell you, especially in the moment, and it ends up being reflexive in the past. And so bringing Pedro into conversation, you use a lot of GSR, so skin conductance, and it's really about capturing things in the moment, but then you're not looking at all of emotion. You're particularly interested in GSR. Why?
Yeah, well, let me just, I'll answer that question. Let me just pick up on something that Flamey said that I think is so important, which is around this myth that constructs or psychological constructs are real things and concrete things that can be measured without error. So a lot of challenges in the industry actually come from this, from, someone has called this reification of psychological constructs, which is attention is a thing that can be linearly measured, or emotion is a thing. And, we see this, and, there's not only on emotion, but also on attention. There's this really live debate today about, the attention economy, and we should be, when people are, 1 million people watch this ad, but with what level of attention, and we should qualify for attention. And then you have all sorts of vendors saying, hey, my measure is the measure of attention. Whether people are looking or not, that's the measure of attention. Whether people are gazing on it, that's the measure of attention. And these are indicators, imperfect indicators of attention, which are somewhat correlated with the psychological construct, what we define as attention. When we look at GSR, for instance, some people tell us, and of course, for companies which are on the market, these are not easy decisions. In the first versions of our platform, what we had next to the electrodermal activity trait was electrodermal activity, EDA. And then clients would ask, oh, hey, but what is EDA? I need something more palpable. And then we would say, arousal. Yeah, but what is that? And then you go back and say, intensity, emotional intensity. But then you're always asked to actually
go another step.
Concrete. Hey, but is it attention or is it emotion? And there is this, but what are you measuring? Are you measuring attention or are you measuring emotion?
Right.
You're measuring sweat gland activity.
Exactly. It's neither. It's neither, and it's both. It's a proxy of whether in our instance, it's a proxy of whether someone cares. So if you build the experiment, or if you have enough sample size, if you're careful with synchronizing everything exactly in the same second and having a lot of people, a decent sample size, you saw coherent GSR with a given amplitude. Okay, that means that people cared about that instance.
Yeah.
Okay. And so that's what you're saying. And what we tell our clients is, hey, that's all we're giving you. We're giving you a measure of whether people care about that.
Which is very brave of you. And that's why I definitely always appreciate your input on this. Now, I do think maybe, Lonnie, you can clarify this as well, that you don't want to really do any of these in a vacuum, right? Because you can measure electrodermal activity, skin conductance, sweat gland behavior, and be able to say something specific about that. Maybe you can call it arousal. Maybe you can call it any number of things depending on your research design, but you probably also have to ask questions, right? To be able to better understand. And so there are explicit methodologies that can be used either in conjunction with these measures, which certainly help, or in place of. So maybe you can't do skin conductance, maybe you do something else. And Toby, I know that MMR does focus on a lot of the more explicit tools. So when you're approached with measuring emotion in your consumers, what are some of the methodologies you use to look at emotion that are more explicit?
To be honest, our view on this is that we probably wouldn't try to measure emotion in consumers. What we're actually interested in is behavior at the end of the day. What is it that we need to do to change consumer behavior to make them stop doing something that they've been doing for a while to do something different? So buy a customer's products instead of somebody else's. Now, all of these techniques that we've looked at, I mean, we do large scale consumer studies, lots of different markets. Most of these techniques, Lani said something really interesting at the beginning, which was, what is an emotion? Well, actually, it's multidimensional and it's made up of physical, physiological, behavioral, different responses, lots of different techniques needed to measure all of those to try and get anywhere close to understanding what emotion is. It's just not practical for us to do all of that in the types of work that we're doing. So what we're much more interested in is trying to understand what the meaning is, the sort of emotion concepts that people apply to the stimulus that we can with, so that we can start to understand somebody that shows an ongoing repeat behavior by buying something over and over again, obviously assigns concepts to that stimuli that is rewarding for them. So what we're really interested in is to understand how we can deliver those concepts more effectively, so that we can deliver more rewards to the individual to stand the best chance of changing their behavior at the end of the day. That way, we don't have to mess around with measuring emotions. So what we're trying to do is to establish what the emotion concepts are that people find rewarding.
I guess a follow-up question that anybody can answer this. There's a question that just came in, really thinking about, okay, so let's say you do have a targeted group of desired emotions, and it could be through your marketing, right? You think about advertisements that are on that might say, Volvo is adventurous. And so it's trying to really push this particular emotional feeling of adventure to drive purchase of the product. So then a question might be, if those are the targets early in the research program, and then does that really improve overall liking of these prototypes, I guess would be the question. And an important one, if you think about it. So if you make this marketing campaign to push the idea of adventure for Volvo, does that actually improve the people's experience of Volvo?
If I can just jump in here, I mean, I think the big issue there is, does it improve liking of Volvo? Yeah. That's not really the issue here, because there's two things that are going to make a campaign more successful. One of them is it's got to engender a certain level of liking, but it has to credibly deliver those emotional associations for it to work. So yeah, there's no point Volvo producing a campaign or a car that people don't like, but what it has to, if they're going to claim that it's adventurous, then it has to make sure that it's credible in doing that, which means that all the different sensory touch points for the brand have to communicate adventurous and not.
But then the actual experience does too. So when they jump in the Volvo and
so the experience is adventurous
and not adventurous, then
jump in.
Yeah,
I think there's a risk of concept creep here. Right. Yeah. We are starting to use the term emotion in such incredibly broad ways. And that actually exacerbates this issue.
Yes.
Tiny little measures to pick up on something that's really, really big conceptually. And so adventurousness is not an emotion. Like adventurousness
right.
is a characteristic.
It is a marketing term for sure.
It's a marketing term, and it's a characteristic of the product that you want to sell.
Yeah.
Now there's a couple things I think buried in there, and from a practical standpoint, it's useful to differentiate them. One is, I think of Volvo and I think adventure. My concept of this car is now connected with my concept of adventure. I understand why Volvo might want to do that, because it's not what most of us think when we think Volvo, right? Because they've been marketing
safe, not adventure. Yeah.
So what would be an appropriate measure? Well, you had implicit association tests on there. Yeah. That's not a measure of emotion. It's not a measure of emotion at all. What it is a fairly useful measure of is the extent to which people associate some target, Volvo, say, versus Porsche, I don't know, right, with adventure versus safety. Now that at an implicit kind of automatic, I'm not thinking about it too hard kind of level, that's how one reasonably appropriate measure to pick up on that. Yeah, that's not a measure of emotion, it's a measure of concept association.
100%.
Toby said of, okay, so now how does that relate to your affective wanting a Volvo? How does that relate to your experience of enjoyment when driving a Volvo is a different question, requiring a different set of measures, and explicitly examining the association between the implicit conceptual measure and the thing that's a little closer to felt affect in that context. But that's the way that you break down that kind of question from a more rigorous scientific perspective.
I think that's a really important thing to bring up. I did put implicit associations on the list for that very reason, because a lot of these measures that we're talking about, whether it's facial coding or GSR, EDA, EEG, they're really basic level emotion things, like, are you aroused? Are you unhappy? Are you like these very basic emotional things? But there are these higher order benefits that products can give us that are things like safety, and cannot be measured by EEG and cannot be measured by, looking at arousal. And so using something like implicit association can give you at least whether these feelings are linked, your feelings for a product and your feelings for this concept. And that's why I included it on there, because there really aren't good ways of measuring feelings of safety outside of just asking someone. And I think that absolutely, you still have to ask people whatever measure you do, right? I mean,
I would even go further than that and say an IAT is not a measure of feelings of anything.
Right. It's just an association.
There's no,
Yeah.
so even the most basic IATs that are used to study what we call implicit prejudice.
Yeah.
It's a reasonably knowledgeable social psychologist will tell you it's not really prejudice in the sense that I explicitly feel negatively towards such and such group. It's deep in my mind, my learned associations with such and such group skew negative, even though I deep in my heart feel positively toward this group. So there's a difference between kind of the cultural network of knowledge that we have and incorporate. That's the thing that creeps out in the IAT. It is by no means equivalent to what we feel. And it's really important not to.
And that is a really important thing to consider, that you can't just, I mean, with IATs for sure, but also with any of these measures, you can't rely it as being exactly measuring that thing, so the association between X and Y doesn't tell you the whole story, right? And so that is really important. Pedro, quickly.
I think that there's like an ongoing discussion around the IAT. There's this author who White is like super critical, Shimak, who maybe Lani has heard of, who's like super critical of the use of IAT besides anything than racial bias, and it's like well,
it is now. So IAT is used in a lot of consumer research to link these ideas, whereas the development is from more of these, looking at prejudices and things of that sort. And so it can be a leap, just as any of the academic emotions work. When they move it into industry, it can be quite a leap from the original intent of the design. And I don't know if that's something you've had a lot of exposure to, Lonnie, of these sort of, I almost want to call it like a bastardization of the original tool.
Again, I think it really, the IAT in particular is one where precision about what it means is so there is actually a good, as an example, there is an IAT. If any of you don't know what we're talking about the IAT, you can take it, right? Just Google IAT Harvard.
Yeah, Project Implicit.
Right, throw implicit in there and it'll pop right up, and there's dozens of them on the site. You can take one and you can see what you can just do it. You can see what it is that we're talking about. There are some that associate group with good or bad, but there are others, and those are called implicit prejudice. But there are others that are, for example, to what extent do you implicitly associate male with science and female with the arts and humanities, right? And so there's no emotion in there, right? But it is picking up on, to what extent does your network of knowledge and understanding of the worldview that you don't have a total lot of control over because it's been influenced by everything that you've been exposed to throughout your life, does it kind of carry that implicit association, implicit stereotype, if you will? All an implicit stereotype is, it's a deeply embedded, not conscious, mostly from your culture, not necessarily consciously endorsed, sometimes consciously loathed, set of connections between ideas that we're walking around with in our heads. That's what it's useful for picking up. Or you go any further than that to assumptions about feelings, beliefs, and you're going to run into all kinds of trouble.
Absolutely. Again, it gets to that interpretation side. Now, I want to get to some of the questions and also bring Tian into the conversation. So there's also thinking about sensory in particular. So some of the things that we've talked about so far have really been about things that are enough of a change or an experience to actually cause an emotion. So if you see something on a video that jumps out at you, obviously you're going to have a change in your, sweat gland activity, and that can be measured as emotional arousal of some sort. But when it comes to tasting different flavors of milk, these may not be very differentiated experiences, right? And so there are not only statistical techniques in dealing with data, how you ask people, but also just in how you would go about measuring that. So Tian, have you looked at, since you come from a very data science approach to looking at these topics, of how, different types of regression analyses, or maybe, different types of statistical analyses can really bring out some of these nuanced differences that really do maybe drive liking?
Right. So this is great discussion that we covered today here. So when we look of this question from the data science perspective, we first need to collect the right set of data, right? So that data set is what we have been talking about. We need to find this right measure first. And then if we collect enough of that, if we want to interpret it, then if we're, like, say, throwing a machine learning model on this data set, what the machine learning model is really just to try to find a predictive of another quantitative measure, whatever this data set is measuring. So if you're measuring response time, then the model will go on the response time, right? So we can talk about the model a little bit later, but what this response time can really relate to, how do you like or dislike, where you want to purchase about this product, that's a big gap here. Yeah, so that's where I feel like it's the whole group of people in this many fields has to work together to see if this model, this data set can answer this very specific question.
And so what you talk about is really that gap, which is so important, right? But there are other challenges maybe in consideration of using AI with the data that you're bringing in when you are looking at these maybe, conceptual ideas, like safety or, some sort of other emotional benefit. So what are some of these challenges that there are for using AI?
Right. So I think from using AI point of view, the question is still coming from the data. Will this data be enough to support the question you're asking? Right. If you're only collecting a small data set that from a specific demographic from one part of the world, then you want to, but the conclusion you're asking, the question you're asking is more general, that you want to apply to different regions, for example, then this data set would not really support that question. It could predict another very similar person if they answer this question, or they measure with your skin conductance or anything. That value could be very far well into this model, but not everybody else.
Now, it's very interesting that you say that, because I think a lot of the push for using what we're going to just call, because that's what the ICO called it, is emotional AI, is that they have been using the algorithms to make predictive models, right? And so if we take eye tracking, for example, there are companies that are using AI algorithms to make predictive models so that they could just measure a small group of people for their eye tracking, and then use their AI algorithm to then predict what a larger group or a different group of people would do. So what are your thinkings on that? I mean, because that's also being used for facial coding, et cetera, and so on.
Exactly. So obviously, the data can only predict what the data has seen, right? So if you have been working on, we all know this just from life experience, that, like, say, gestures or facial expressions are very different from, like, say, the Western world versus, like, say, the Asian culture people, right? There are just these differences there. And if that data, that differences has not been covered, or say using as a variable in the model, then the model outcome will not think of that at all. They will only think of what this data has been provided to tell us. So the conclusion obviously will not cover everything. So that's where I think a lot of this AI question is on today, is why this AI doesn't give us a good results. It's not really, it's not the method, it's not right. It's the data just not really to tell us, being able to tell us that.
I want to really echo what Tian's saying and carry it even further, that a lot of the methods that are being used right now are sort of treat a single measure from a single individual as having meaning.
Yeah.
And they very rarely do, because it only means something in relation to how that person would be at another time point. Someone's heart rate only has meaning in relation to their own heart rate over time, right? Otherwise, because just regular heart rate varies among individuals to such an enormous extent. Facial expressions, as Tian mentioned, there's cultural variability. There's also individual variability. So let's say that you want to know how people respond to different flavors of milk, and you bring me into the lab, and I'm tasting different ones, and some of them I smile and some of them I go, ugh, right? And then you compare me against, but I'm pretty expressive. So you compare me against another person who comes into the lab, and maybe they only smile, but they don't show disgust, and somebody else does the other things. Well, a lot of that variability in that expression has nothing to do with the milk, or very little to do with the milk. It has a lot more to do with our individual differences in overall expressivity, in tendency to express some emotions rather than others. Some emotions, when they show up on the face, people pretty much smile when they enjoy something, but you start to get to other kinds of emotions, and you get a lot more nuance in there, especially if you're doing any kind of automated facial coding. Is it going to understand that difference? Quite possibly not.
And that is what the ICO was warning the most about. I think there was particular focus on AI-based facial coding.
There's a lot of good reason to be very concerned about AI.
And so has anybody here used AI-based facial coding? And if so, what was your experience? So we have, because we were kind of pushed to use it by a client once. We always recommend against it, to be honest. But they really wanted to do it. They said, just to find out. All right, you want to just find out, it's probably not going to give you a lot of information. And that's exactly what happened, especially when you have something that isn't very emotive, that it falls flat for the most part, or can be very hard to interpret, because and the amount of data that gets thrown out by the algorithm just because someone's wearing glasses or has facial hair. So I'm sorry, Toby, but I think you would be thrown out of the study. So there are a lot of these problems that really come along with it. But I was mentioning here that we were pressured to use it, even though we recommend against it. So there is pressure to use certain tools or make claims around emotion sometimes that comes from the client themselves. So can you describe an instance where you were maybe pushed?
I didn't get that.
Oh.
Could you try again?
My watch. So Toby, have you been in a situation where you've been sort of pushed by a client to maybe really, make claims about emotion, or that they would really like you to add some sort of methodology that you weren't terribly comfortable with?
Yeah, we have. I mean, we've played with facial coding in the past, and we have worked with clients that have used it. But you can see exactly why people do find it quite an attractive proposition, because actually the tools that they're using are phenomenal. The way that the software works, the way that you watch some of these things play back, it's giving you sort of second by second playback in terms of what the emotion they think people are experiencing based on their facial expressions. And the trouble is, it's kind of like, it's nothing wrong with the technology. What's completely wrong is the underlying sort of principles behind what it's actually measuring at the time. It's not measuring these emotions at all. All it's doing is measuring small facial movements, and it's only really looking at the face. What you lose. So if you think about doing this if we do this traditionally using a sort of very experienced qualitative researchers to do something like this in the past, they pick up on lots more body language, they pick up on the context of what's going on in the background, and all of that has a huge influence on why, to Lani's point, if you've got an expressive face, or if somebody's just wandered past in the background and they're wearing a clown's mask or whatever, there's all these other influences that you just don't get. It's such a isolated view and things. And then trying to distill that down to single emotions on a second by second basis, when emotions are hugely complex, they don't just boil down to one thing.
We feel multiple things.
And at the end of the day, I mean, what maybe you're talking about 7-10 basic emotions in most of these software, and you think, well, how am I going to get any sort of diagnostic value from that at the end of the day? And what am I learning from this that I probably couldn't have learned by spending a lot less money and doing it, taking another route to this?
So how do you know, and this goes for everybody, how do you know when you've over-interpreted results? So how do you find that balance between telling a good story about the research versus maybe making excessive claims?
Can I?
Yeah, go ahead, Pedro.
I can try to answer that one. So sometimes there's, when you have big sets of data, on one hand, there's always the tendency for you to sort of build ad hoc, especially if you're in the industry, build ad hoc explanations about why you're seeing a given pattern on the data. So again, looking at what we do, you're looking at physiological activity, and then suddenly you see that everyone exhibits a coherent, very high amplitude galvanic skin response. And then what you try to do, and what you're tempted to do, is sort of build an ad hoc story around that. And you're sort of tempted to, oh, this was because, this person came on stage, the commentator said something, someone used this camera angle. And some of the challenges that we have most of the times are trying to limit the tendency of clients to build ad hoc explanations when they're looking at the data. So what we try to do is we try to do everything sort of hypothesis based. So let's build this set of hypotheses, and those are the things that we will be looking at the data on. And then we need multiple instances of a given event. So if I'm looking at an example such a camera angle, well, if they're in a given camera angle, there's just so many things that are happening. So if you're in a racing sport, there's the camera angle, but then there's also who's the pilot, what's being said, who's the second, is this important or not? There's just so many things that you can't make any conclusion about the effectiveness of that camera angle, except if you have a really, really strong hypothesis on one hand, and if you have so many events that you can average out everything else that is happening. This is a really hard thing to do, and it's a really hard thing to sort of discipline clients to do.
Right.
But I think that it's the only way how in the end we'll get value out of this data, because if you're building ad hoc explanations, you'll see a pattern in one day and you'll make an explanation, and then on the other instance, the thing won't be happening, and hey, where's
So I do think a really important thing that you brought up there was almost like training clients to ask better questions in a way, right? So like, and really thinking about ways to design this type of research to get the most value out of it. And that kind of brings in that, you have a very academic background in research, and as does, Tian, I know you do as well. And so a question for Lonnie actually is, here you are, the academic on this panel, and here we are on this side of industry where people are utilizing a lot of the measurements that are coming from academia. Do you get much of an opportunity to see the industry side? And I bring that up because, years ago, David from MMR, David Thompson, and I were actually at an Effective Society meeting where we were presenting to people attending there that these measures are being done. And everybody seemed a bit shocked that they were being used. And so a question for you is, do you get the opportunity to see this? And do you see opportunities here for academia and industry to perhaps collaborate a little bit more, to help this problem, I'm going to say?
So the answer to your first question is no. And that's not to say that I don't. So where I come into contact with industry usually involves somebody reaching out to me saying, we want to develop an algorithm to use bracelets that tell people which emotion they're feeling. And I just say,
we get that a lot too.
Can't help you with that. Not going to happen, but do something else. We're a very long way from that. And I don't actually, I think it's unlikely that that's how the circuitry works at all. So that's kind of the extent of it from what I see. They are very different worlds and with very different constraints and rules on communication. In terms of collaborating, I mean, I think one thing that you have to get around is that the motivations are very different, right? So you approach most academic psychologists who are really embedded in the basic research and say, we want to ask this question because we want to sell something. And they're going to go, I don't know, what is it that you're trying to sell? How I feel about it. So, you're going to have to work your way around that potentially very large difference in mission.
Yeah.
The difference in mission is not necessarily that great. If you're asking me honestly, I think the most sensible thing to do is to, the way that this collaboration might really work is to meet midway between the interests, or at least try to find a way in which they can both be met. So I, as an academic, what I want to do is grow knowledge. I want to understand how these basic systems linking emotion and physiology and motivation and behavior work. I care about that a great deal because I care about helping people lead healthier lives. And we all know how hard it is to struggle with that, right? I got home at 10 o'clock last night after a long day of work and events and was like, am I really going to work out now? Probably not, right? So, we're all dealing with those issues. And so I care about the mechanisms behind that. And the truth is, those might be the same mechanisms that you as a company might be interested in leveraging. And so what it looks like to meet halfway is, we work on a contract basis to answer a question that will help us both.
Yeah.
And those kinds of partnerships are quite possible. We're all looking for money at this point to try to do our job. And do
I can add on to this as well, because we work with the industry a lot, and a lot of times we collaborate with academic people as well. So what we're trying to do is to really talk to the industry, the client, and really trying to define a good question that they want to ask. So there's a lot of boundaries. So there's no magic emotion AI in that sense, but then we have a very specific question that they want to know. Then we'll bring that internal and we talk to academic people, and there we really try to solve this very specific question. So if this one under this contract, like this question is solved, they're very happy to answer that question. Whether they, in the future plans, step by step, it could be kind of expand to a bigger question, a bigger problem to solve. That's the future thing. We need to do it step by step. Yeah. So I do think we can collaborate though.
And I think that's actually a really good segue into where I want to take us next, because we are coming up on time and there are a billion questions both in the chat and Q&A, as well as things we could continue to talk about. And this happens every time we do one of these panel discussions. There's so much more we could talk about. And so what I'd love to be able to do is take any of these questions and feed them to all of you, and maybe we can answer them over email to the people who've asked them. So everybody, if you haven't had your question answered and you still have questions, feel free to go ahead and enter it in the chat or in the Q&A, and we'll get back to you. But I do want to talk about the future, just exactly what you're talking about, Tian, and so the future. So Pedro, I'm going to go to you. Your thoughts for next steps for physiological measurement. Where do you see it going? Is, we're constantly being pushed with, oh yeah, I've heard about this, watch or this armband that can read my mind. Obviously, we're not going to be there anytime soon, if at all. But where do you see the next steps for this area?
Well, I can. Again, so from our perspective, and my area of expertise, we're sort of a one-trick pony, and what I really can foresee is the future of measuring, let's call it emotional impact, for lack of as if this was a real thing, measuring emotional impact to media using this type of physiological data. I think that the next step is actually activation on these measures in real time. So we figured out how to measure them. We figured out how to sort of process this data in scale in real time. We figured out how to process it with validity. And I think that the next step is actually making sure that on one hand there's some outcomes that this type of data is related to, which is what the industry is doing right now. Hey, this is predictive of outcomes of value, either linearly isolated, combined with other data, and now starting to activate on the data. So starting to provide this data in real time and activate it to a variety of ways. I think that this is the next step. I also think that the industry will start to be scrutinized, and this is sort of a wishful thinking. I think that the industry will start to be scrutinized, because more and more people.
I've been hoping that for years. But maybe with things like this, the ICO statement, it's helping it along.
I mean, we're seeing that. I've had very welcome clients who we started working with last year, who in the first meeting that we had with them, big clients, the first meeting that we had with them, say, hey guys, this is an independent consultant. He's a professor in your area from the MIT. He's here to keep you in line. This is super useful. And
Yeah.
this is, super welcome, because
Great point.
actually, if you're serious, those people will actually help you. They'll be on your side and not on the client
So they
side.
could be bringing in you, Lonnie, and say, you know what, we're thinking about using this vendor. Can you help us vet what they're doing? I think that that is a great thing to do. Yeah. And now, Toby, when it comes to looking at what clients are asking for, when it comes to maybe emotional components to, consumer work, are you seeing any particular trends in what your clients are asking for?
Yeah, I think most people would still like to have a magic button that they could push to give them the answers to what's going on in everybody's minds. And I think that's what we've got, moving forwards, we've got to try and resist is, all these techniques that we're talking about here, they're great. They are measuring things that are probably quite useful. But if we can start to think about how they correlate with understanding behavior rather than trying to use them to understand what's going on in people's minds, then I think we might be onto something. And we've got to think about different ways to start to understand what the sort of the conceptual architecture is that's inside people's heads, because I don't think you can wire people up to anything and get an answer on that, to be honest with you.
So going on to Tian, while facial coding and AI together may not be the best of plans, it would seem, how do you see AI integrating in better with consumer research?
Right. I think, well, in consumer research, there are many, many ways that we could use AI. If we have, the right data about the products, the consumer behavior can definitely help. The model will help predict the target that the model has defined, right? But even with the emotion AI part, if we start to gather the right amount of the right data, to consciously collect the different variables, different factors that could affect this outcome, then this new data set could be really helpful to move the emotion AI forward. Because I don't really think this is a wrong thing, but if we have seen the right form of the data and different factors, as Toby said, could affect how being these measures, where we move forward on interpreting this measure to the right emotion, all of this working together will help moving this field forward. Yeah,
that's perfect. Now, Lonnie, I'm going to end on you, and then I'll ask one more question of everybody. But Lonnie, where do you see next steps for emotions research?
Oh, no, I actually have been thinking about this a lot recently. So I think you alluded to differences in theories at the very beginning here, and that's been a driving factor in emotions research for decades now, is which theory is right. Stupid question. They're all right in a way, and they're all wrong in a way. And what we really need to be doing is research that integrates, that acknowledges that when we talk about emotion, we're talking about loosely correlated phenomena that appear to have some kind of motivational direction, right? And to understand, to kind of get out of the competitive space around that, and work toward understanding better how that system actually works, taking the strengths of what we have learned about what we talk about when we talk about emotion. And as Toby alluded to earlier, really understanding implications for behavior. And that is actually very much a movement in the field right now, is being more cautious about, which of these aspects of emotional responding relate to how we understand what's happening in the environment, and then what we're going to do about it, because the potential to have positive impact on people's lives through behavior.
And for us on the industry side, what that really means is, does it matter? Like, is there an actionable result that comes out of any of this research? And so I think that is a great goal. Now for all of you to,
helping people, I think fulfilling the promise of helping people enhance their well-being. 100%.
So a quick question for everybody to talk about, because there's actually a lot of chatter in the chat talking about how they would love more time to be able to talk about this subject, to get more questions answered, to have you guys discuss, your experiences more. So maybe there's something that we can do in the future to talk about this more. But really quickly, how can people best reach out to you? We're happy, like I said, if you want to contact us with the emails that we've sent when you registered, we can connect you to anyone. But really quickly, I'll go around and have you say what's the best way to reach out to you. So Pedro, what's the easiest way to find you?
I would say LinkedIn, Pedro R. Almeida. I think I'm easy to find.
Perfect. Tian.
Right, the same. I think LinkedIn is the best way to find me. Yep.
Toby.
Yeah, actually probably through the contacts on the company website, MMR Research Worldwide.
Cool. And Lonnie, what's the best way to reach you? Email. So we can probably find that on the website, right?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay, great. So if you want to reach out to us, we can help with you with any of that. But thank you, everybody. I know we went a little bit over, so thank you, everybody, for sticking around. Thank you most to the panelists for joining us. Your insight has been invaluable, and I hope that we can continue the conversation in other ways. So thank you so much, everybody. Have a great evening or afternoon, wherever you are.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye.